That we have Jimmy Bauman joining us today from Farm up in northern Minnesota. Jimmy is going to be talking to us about nutrient management in his deep compost mulch system. And I will be sharing my screen with Jimmy's slides and advancing them as we go through. So yeah, hopefully everyone can see that screen now, and I will hand it over to you, Jimmy. Take it away.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Rue, for inviting me to speak. As she said, my name is Jimmy Bauman. This is my 12th year in production. I farm with my wife, Heather. We run the business together. Although this is our 12th season, we did not move into our current location until 2019 when we finally were able to buy our own property. So as you can see on the map, the red balloon is where we are located, about an hour north of the Twin Cities. We're in zone 4A, and our soil type is fine sand. I know this is kind of important because I'm guilty of this just as much as everyone, but you go to a conference, you see a presentation, you read a book or see a YouTube video, and you're like, oh wow, this is how I need to do this. This is the way our farm needs to go. But then you forget about putting things into context. Our farming is in a different place than yours. Our soil's different. There's so many variables. So I always just tell people to take other people's farming advice with a grain of salt. That's advice from other farmers, advice from agronomists, advice from scientists. There's so much that we don't know about how the soil does what it does. So we just need to keep our eyes open and keep observing everything. We starting in 2020, we doubled our CSA members to 200. I know of a lot of farms that saw an increase in CSAs because of COVID. And that was this has been a really good fit for us. We've been trying to maintain that number moving forward. So we have a 21-week CSA season, early June till the end of October. We also work 2 farmers markets every Saturday. And then for 6 weeks in November and December, we have like a winter CSA program. The boxes are smaller than the summer and typically have, I don't know, not quite 2/3 of the membership as the summer. So that keeps us pretty busy, almost year round. Yeah, we can move to the next slide. This is an aerial photo of our farm before we moved in. We have just one soil type, and our field is flat and sandy. If we go on the next slide, you can see what it looks like as a couple years ago. We just counting the production space, is about 2 acres. So we're doing things really intensively to pull off the 200 shares and 2 farmers markets. We're grossing about $90,000 per acre. We're not doing microgreens. We don't grow corn. We stopped growing melons. We don't grow cauliflower anymore. Or sweet potatoes. It's a little too cold in our area for reliable sweet potatoes, but just about everything else, to have a nice balanced box for our CSA customers. And in this photo, the bottom right, near the big greenhouse there, that tan square patch is what our soil looks like naturally. That was before we put that into production. So you can see, using the deep compost mulch on top of our soil, really, obviously there's a big contrast there. Yeah, let's move to the next slide. We got our inspiration for the deep compost mulch system from Richard Perkins. We own his book as well as his YouTube videos. So the Ridgedale Farm method of the deep compost mulching system which is not what we did initially. But his method is to apply 4 to 6 inches of quality compost with wood chips in the walkways. So again, we're pretty typical market farm, 4 foot wide beds on center, including the walkway. Most of them are 100 feet long. And there's an emphasis on good quality compost. And I say that because, it's nice to have a consistent product that you're working with that is going to be free of weed seeds and pathogens. So we buy our compost from a compost making facility in one of the nearby suburbs, about 30-40 minutes away. I requested, several of their analyses, and so I could see how consistent things were. That being said, it's an organic thing that they're making, so sometimes the compost comes in and it's really soggy. Sometimes it's more coarse than I would like to see. But it's kind of the best thing we can find nearby. About a third of the cost of the compost is paying our trucker to bring it to us. So we have 40 yards dumped at a time. So yeah, the initial application should be quite thick, so it does act like a mulch, suppressing the weeds that would be below it. Basically just putting enough compost over your beds to prevent weeds from germinating. This method, the strategy is not really going to work great on really tenacious perennials like quackgrass or Canada thistle or whatever your favorite perennial weed is in your area. So yeah, we can go to the next slide. So we buy a yard waste compost. Since we're using so much compost, yard waste compost seems to be cheaper than manure composts if they're available. Our facility doesn't even have manure-based composts, but I think a big worry about a lot of growers who are using this much compost is excessive nutrients, especially phosphorus. So I feel like that the yard waste compost is a little bit, it's got less of everything and it's the cheaper source of organic matter. And I can add the missing elements through other amendments when they come up. And I like to buy compost in the fall and have it stockpiled for the next season. We kind of learned the hard way one spring. We had a few loads come in early on in the season that had a lot of lamb's quarter in it, actually. And I feel like they're, trying to heat up this compost when it was too cold out and it didn't heat up enough. And then furthermore, I don't know if in southern Wisconsin they have road weight restrictions in the spring, but in our part of the state, Minnesota, you can't, on certain roads, you can't bring a big truck like that in. So, and usually that restriction is lifted for us, 2 to 3 weeks in, at least, to the growing season, the spring growing season. So not having enough compost on hand when you need it is not very good. So we consider ourselves a no-till farm, a low-till farm, minimal tillage. But the very first thing we did when we closed on our property in the spring of 2019 is we hired the neighbor to flip over the soil with a moldboard plow. We really had no choice in the matter since we needed to begin production immediately. So we needed that. It was essentially a hayfield for 20 years to not be sod anymore. And it was actually, for a spring tillage event, it was pretty effective taking care of the sod. And, the quackgrass, some sods came back pretty good, but we take the time in the spring and whenever we're flipping beds to physically dig out the quackgrass roots. It's a lot of work, but I would really be surprised if this spring, if we had, I know of a couple spots where we're going to have to dig out some quack, but for the most part, we've eliminated it from our fields, which is really good. And that's, obviously really important to not have weeds, but especially if you're trying to flip beds, within a couple days of clearing them, the fewer weeds you have, the better. the initial application of deep compost 4 to 6 inches is an investment, but it will pay for itself, especially if you can maintain that weed-free environment. And that's the key. That year that we had the dirty compost come in, we didn't budget enough time or labor to really remove all of the weeds that were growing. And last year we kind of paid for that with lots of weeding. But I feel like we had a pretty good success on managing our weeds from last year. We even, in September, when you got a 6-inch tall lamb's quarter plant and it's got seeds on it, those things are just designed to set seed before it's too late. So I had crew members weeding open patches of field before broadcasting oats and peas for a winter kill cover crop. We spent a lot of money on weeds last year, but that is also an investment that will, pay for itself in the long run. If the alternative is an increase in your weed seed bank moving forward. And I know there's some growers who don't really believe that there is such a thing as like reducing your weed seed bank, but we have proof of that with our farm having our field just being a hayfield for 20 years. We flipped that under, and our first year in 2019, we saw really, really low weed pressure. Unfortunately, it's gotten worse from there for a couple of years of neglecting some areas, but keep up on the annual weeds setting seed, and it'll eventually get better. Yeah, we go to the next slide. So we have soil science and soil biology. My old agronomist we used to work with us even said this himself, like we don't know more than we do know when it comes to soil. So let's just keep our eyes open, keep mimicking nature whenever we can see it. There's no place in nature that has bare ground for very long. There's always something trying to grow there. So we try to mimic that on our farm. Being as intensive as we are, and the 2 acres that we are growing are in production every year. We don't have enough space to fallow anything. So when it is the height of the growing season, especially mid-June to mid-July, mid-June rolls around, our field is pretty much completely planted, but we still have successions to make, especially for those farmers markets with little maintenance plantings. So we're always looking for beds to clear out and replant. And it's been there's a few instances where we can clear a bed and replant it that same day, but typically it might be just a few days. But usually we don't let any bed not have things growing on it for more than a week. And we try to keep the soil growing something at all times. Reducing or eliminating tillage is another strategy for a healthy soil. Leave the roots in the ground when possible. They provide structure and habitat for mycelium, and there's so many interactions with soil life that we are just not even starting to understand. I know there's a lot of no-till growers group on no-tillgrowers.com, or lots of people are really strict about leaving roots in the ground. We do it when it makes sense. I'm not gonna sit there and cut out rows of direct seeded spinach or something by hand when we're done with them. I might tarp it and give it a week and then rake it out. I'm hoping to use more tarps to clear beds, because we're trying to have a profitable business. We're not like a research farm or mycelium habitat, essentially. That being said, I'm also not a purist when it comes to no-till. Like I use a power harrow to get beds ready. I do set it as shallowly as I can, which is generally about an inch. We set it as deep as we need to incorporate fertilizers, especially the nitrogen-based ones that need to be incorporated into the soil and decomposed to become fertilizer for plant food. And then I'm also not afraid to harrow an inch down to just make a nice seed bed or transplant bed. So it's pretty easy to transplant by hand. I don't want to be chiseling away at our soil just to be no-till. I employ strategies on our farm that make sense to me, and I'm not a purist for anything except, obviously I'm organic, so I'm not going to switch over to chemicals for a quick fix or anything like that. Let's see, we can go on the next slide. One of the things I've heard about no-till issues with no-till is nutrient stratification. I don't think that is a big issue on an organic vegetable farm. We are nurturing our soil life, so it will bring things from the surface down into the soil. And the fact that a lot of times, at least on our farm, outdoors, we're getting 2 to 3 crops a year, the quick rotation type stuff. So there's lots of opportunities for the soil to be worked in that respect, whether it's cultivating or hoeing, or pulling out carrots or forking carrots to pull them. You're working the soil that way. You can see in this picture, this is a hole I dug in the greenhouse a couple days ago where we've never tilled. I can't even bring my walk behind tractor inside the greenhouse. The hole is at least a foot deep, but you can see over 6 inches down is dark compost. Made its way down there from broad forking. It made its way down there from earthworms, other soil life. Our soil is very sandy. It's fine sand. There's no loam, nothing loamy about it. So it resists compaction. Therefore, we are dialing back on the amount that we broad fork. A couple of years ago, we were trying to broad fork pretty much every bed before planting, and it proved to be very expensive and time consuming. So starting last year and moving forward, we're really only going to broad fork before carrots and parsnips so that they grow straight. We can avoid tillage by avoiding compaction. So we are never driving or walking on the beds when as much as possible. There's an asterisk next to never, because if I got a lot of stuff to seed with my 3-row jang seeder, I'm going to walk on the bed because it's really awkward to push it kind of hunched over on your side. If I got like 2 beds to seed, then yeah, I'll stand in the walkway, but I'm not a purist again. We go to the next slide. There's a couple pictures of our, on the right is our Grillo walk behind tractor. We have axle extensions, so more or less I think there's about 32 inches between the tires. So that's another strategy, keeping the weight off the beds. And then the picture on the left is on the front end of our Kubota tractor. I had to order spacers to have the wheels far enough apart for our beds to fit under the 32 inches. And unfortunately, the tires were hitting the loader's mounting bracket. So I cut away enough of that so the tires had clearance. And then my little sister welded reinforcement on there. So we definitely take extra steps to make sure we're not compacting the soil. We can go to the next slide. On the left is our field in its first year production, 2019. We did spread 1 load of compost for us, which is about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of compost. And I think I was still kind of harrowing things deeper than I do now. So a lot of that compost did get incorporated into our sandy soil. The photo on the right was taken in 2022. So you can see the change of color of our soil from all that compost. And if you notice on the bottom, on the right-hand picture, the bottom left corner, that picture is a little white thing. Every about 10 beds in our field, I installed 2 bricks or pavers. And I measure off of those pavers, which are permanently in place. And we flag our beds before driving the tractor in the field with our compost spreading machine. So then our beds are always in the same spot and we're never driving on the beds, not even by accident, when as much as possible. So we go to the next slide. soil chemistry and soil biology. I have had our soils tested every year since we started growing. Um, it's not that, it's not expensive when you factor in the amount of information that you're gleaning from that. And this slide is mostly talking about what we have been doing on our new farm since 2019. Our main source of nitrogen has been the composted poultry manure pellets, or CPM. It's a 432 with plenty of calcium. It addresses nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium in a good way. It's pretty affordable. I was doing about 18 pounds of the product for a 100-foot bed. It's about 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre, 60-40 respectively. But since 2020, when we were really upping our compost game, we reduced that to about 14 pounds or 60 pounds of N per acre. There are, aside from the long season heavy feeding greenhouse crops, I have side dressed things in the past that are a little bit longer season, and that would mostly be like the transplanted brassicas, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, leeks, anything that's really in the ground for more than 2 months, 2.5 months, except for our onions are grown in landscape fabric, so I'm not able to really do any kind of side dressing there. Since we were fortunate enough to have the same type of soil on our field, we could really give the whole field the same treatment each spring. We by addressing the soil chemistry needs. As diversified vegetable growers, it's really going to be quite impossible to have a tight enough rotation where you can have, at least on my end, I can't just have different fuel blocks and I'm treating differently. So I was really adamant about every part of the production areas getting the same amendments, so we didn't have any surprises down the road, really. Since my first year farming, we've used gypsum every single season. It's a good source of sulfur and calcium. But if you're trying to raise your pH to closer to neutral, limestone would be preferred. We've been using a little bit of boron in small amounts for the whole field, and I do know like beets and cole crops like a little extra boron, and sometimes I would give those beds a little extra boron, a little more than the other, kind of blanket treatment. But as far as I know, boron is a leachable element, so it shouldn't be accumulating. I don't want to have like hot spots that I don't know about. We used a little sulfate of potash to increase our potassium levels the first year, but it was only the first year. Then we could kind of make by with our composted poultry manure. I never used any rock phosphorus or anything, and we'll see in a later slide our actual soil test results. And it did call for phosphorus our first year. We were a little low, but we didn't add any. We figured we were getting enough from the compost, and if not from the compost, from the poultry manure. Some of the things that we need to add to our soil, since we're not really using too many manure products, would be the trace minerals. So we use metal sulfates for that. Copper sulfate, zinc sulfate, and manganese sulfates are the ones that we used. But you should be mindful of these trace minerals. You can get things to be in a toxic level pretty quickly. And our pH, when we started, was 6.5, and at the beginning of last season, it was up to 7.7. The farmer before us had said he put down a bunch of lime, which meant he put down too much lime. So we are combating that as best we can with we used elemental sulfur in all of our growing spaces in the spring of 2020. I'm sorry, 2022. And the elemental sulfur. So sulfur in itself is not going to acidify your soil. it's the conversion of elemental sulfur to sulfuric acid. Then sulfuric acid will then bind with the free calcium carbonate that's in your soil, and that's when you start to see your pH become more acidic. Let's see. Oh, I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah. In soils that have like a heavier texture, more clay content, and I've seen research papers on this. The addition of elemental sulfur really isn't going to correct that, just because these heavier soils, depending on what their makeup is, could just be naturally heavy in that calcium carbonate. So even though you might see more of an acidic environment for a couple seasons, it's gonna just be too expensive, and just it's not gonna work on those types of soils. So last spring we also used a little humic acid in the thoughts of trying to acidify our soil. At the very minimum, our soil biology kind of appreciated the humates. Humic acid is just basically pulverized low-grade coal. And bentonite clay. If we can go to the next slide. Got a couple of pictures of our mineral treatments, is what we call it, each spring. Every bed receives the same amendments based on our soil samples. So on the left-hand side, we've got the elemental sulfur, boron, and gypsum in one pile because they're kind of pellets or coarser materials. And on the right would be the blue stuff is the copper sulfate. I can't remember if we did any manganese or zinc in with that last year, but we mixed the copper sulfate in with the bentonite clay. It's also called Redmond soil conditioner, or at least the product we buy. And then the sulfuric acid, or I'm sorry, the humic acid. The sulfate powder, everything on the right is very powdery. So we had two separate mineral treatments that we were applying to the beds. It's just a good way to spread things evenly. We weigh our mixtures into 5-gallon buckets using a scale, and we apply it by hand. The CPM, or the poultry manure fertilizer, is applied in the same way. I've tried a drop spreader in the past, and it just doesn't seem to really be that accurate. The textures of even the pelleted poultry manure can vary depending on, I don't know what the variables are, but the sizes can be different. So to me, it's just easiest and most straightforward to spread stuff with a 5-gallon bucket. Furthermore, with these metal sulfates, if you're using them for your trace minerals, it was really like 3 pounds of the actual product per acre. So trying to spread that evenly would be difficult. So that's another reason why we just mix it in with the bentonite clay. It helps with the application. We can go on the next slide. Here I've compiled soil sample results. On the left 3 columns are 2019 prior to any production. The right side columns are the most recent test we had pulled, which was the fall of last year, so just a few months ago. The notable things I would point out.
Can I ask a quick question before you go through that, Jimmy?
Yeah.
I was wondering how deep you're sampling, because obviously now that you've got some layers of compost on top, you're sampling through that. What would you, and I assume that you're going down into the native soil, what's the total depth of sample that you generally would take?
6 inches.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that's just because the way it's done. Another one of those things you might have to think a little bit more about. I guess I have heard no-till growers sampling maybe 4 inches, but 6 seems fine. I don't know. What do you think, Rue?
I think that's pretty standard. And I think if you're going deeper than that, you probably want to be, like, I might go to 8 inches, but going much deeper than that, I don't think, I think the root zone is the important area to set.
Yeah,
You know, that's what you care
as,
about. So
yeah, and as far as I understand, most of the roots that are actually eating the plant food or plant available nutrients are in the top 6 inches anyway.
yeah, yeah. Okay,
Um,
I was just curious
yeah,
because
no,
you know you
and
have a fair layer of compost that's building up on top. So
yeah, and it's crazy how we'll get to this a little bit more in a second, but for a couple years in a row we were putting about 3 inches of compost onto the beds, and it's crazy by the end of the season how it's like disappeared.
yeah.
I mean, our soil is really sandy, so it really eats up that organic matter, but yeah, it's just really it just gets incorporated.
Hmm,
Um,
that's interesting. Thanks.
yeah. So some things that are the most noteworthy on this page would be the improved cation exchange capacity, the CEC, and the increase in organic matter. Um, those two things I feel like are a little bit might be some of the most challenging things to improve. But otherwise, you can see kind of across the board our levels getting all the way to the right, as it were. We're approaching almost 100 ppm on phosphorus, which is something to keep our eye on. As far as I know, once you're getting up to 150 parts per million of phosphorus, you can start to see nitrogen and iron being tied up through the soil chemistry. So um, we'll have to see if and when we get to that point and what we're going to do to mitigate that. Um, Yeah, so the next slide will kind of shows you what we actually did on the farm. We did not do the initial 4 to 6 inches as explained that Richard Perkins likes to do when he's setting up new plots. Our first year moving in, we were still kind of coming off of our old habits, our old strategies. So we just did one dump is what we like to call it, which at the bottom right corner of the photograph is our compost spreading machine. So one full load would do about 1.5 inches of compost per bed, per 100-foot bed. And then 2022 happened and we doubled our CSA and we were like, oh my gosh, we don't have time to mess around and we've got a lot more money than we're used to seeing up front. So we decided that we're going to start doing the compost real thick. So we did that for 2020 as well as 2021. And then last year we just went back to the one dump of compost. 2021 was the year that we had the dirty compost come in and had a lot of lamb's quarter, kind of different spots of the field, drop a bunch of seeds. So last year, coming out of that, we had the increased pressure from the annual weeds as well as not as thick layer of compost. So we had plenty of weeding to do last year, which is what we are trying to avoid with the deep compost mulch system. And so I kind of feel like dialing back the compost last year was actually kind of smart. We were able to take care of a lot of those weeds that germinated instead of just burying them and waiting for them to come up later. Um, Granted, we didn't, not every seed that dropped the previous year germinated, and I'm sure we're going to have spots where that's going to be worse than others. And had we done this all over again, I think putting down the initial layer 4 to 6 inches and then maintaining that year after year, maybe just an inch after that to maintain those levels would be a wise approach, and that's what I would do if I was to do it over again. So we actually have, if you show the next slide, I have highlighted the white box closer to the greenhouse. These beds, we are now going to be considering our high rotation area. quick maturing crops, 2 to 3 crops per season. The unhighlighted areas will be like the low rotation, long season crops. We'll probably just, do the 1 load of compost per season in the spring in these areas. So half of the highlighted white area, we will be putting 4.5 inches of compost down with wood chips in the aisles. Because we feel like you need that real thick base application to really bury those weeds and then just maintain it moving from there. But if if we start to get to the point where we're approaching dangerous levels of anything, we'll probably have to dial back the amount of compost we're applying down and then just rely on old-fashioned cultivation, which, cultivating is different than hoeing. Cultivating and hoeing, you're doing pretty much the same method, the same action. Cultivating is doing it on time, the white thread stage of those weeds, before you can even really see them coming out of the ground. And the ABCs of cultivating are always be cultivating. I didn't make that up. I stole that from somebody. Just like all my best ideas, just glean the best ideas, make them work on your farm in your context. Make sure you're seeing the whole picture, which is hard for us to do. An example of that was we have 5 caterpillar tunnels, and in the past, before we had a heated greenhouse, we would push production into these unheated tunnels as late as we could into December because we had the winter CSA going. And so in order to have fall crops mature in time for the winter, we would move our caterpillar tunnels twice a year. So in the early spring, we plant them to the cold season spring crops. Mid-May, late May rolls around for us, and it's time to plant our nightshades into them, tomatoes, peppers, maybe even cucumbers, whatever. We move the tunnels over one spot over the warm season stuff, and then again in early October uncover the warm season stuff to plant our winter and fall production crops. And we continued to do this even after we built our big heated greenhouse. And then one day I was like, why are we trying to make these crappy ass unheated tunnels do something that they're not really good at doing? We have this big greenhouse that's big enough for all of our salad greens, so we stopped moving them in the fall. And it was just one of those, and it's just an example of like, this is how we've been doing it, so you just keep on doing it, and then you realize, like, why are we doing this? Doesn't make any sense. So yeah, we are going to be putting down a lot more compost on our beds after they've already seen a lot of compost. And this is in hopes to really hopefully eliminate a lot of weeding. And we're focusing these resources on the beds that are closer. And these are the beds that we'll see 2 to 3 crops per year. And if we have hardly any weeding to do, we can flip these beds really quickly. We don't have to fuss around with that. The far ends of the fields, the low rotation, will receive less. Because the fact is, although, we are a no-till farm, we consider, or low-till, whatever you want to say, but we use our tractor to dig a trench to plant the potatoes, and we use the tractor to cultivate and hill the potatoes. We work the soil, as much as we need to for the potatoes. We got them in mechanical potato digger. So by the time the potatoes are done, there's no compost mulch left on top. It's pretty well incorporated into the soil. So everything else that leaks are another crop that really mess up our beds. So those are going to be kicked out to the distant fields. Because it's the thing, we can't keep this deep compost mulch in place when we are disturbing the soil as much as we are doing with those crops. So why don't we talk about the greenhouse? We can go to the next slide. The greenhouse we got was a kit from Noltz. I think Zimmerman, somebody makes it. I don't know. It's 30 feet by 144 feet. The first thing we did was I rented an excavator and dug a 2-foot deep trench around the whole perimeter of what was going to be the greenhouse site. But before I did that, we put down 3 inches of compost, and that kind of sat there the whole season while we chipped away at the greenhouse. I would harrow it time to time for weeds. But it was nice to get that base application of compost in before we made it impossible to get a tractor in there. The 2-foot deep trench made it possible for us to put 2 feet of 1.5-inch pink foam insulation around the whole perimeter. We've got a polycarbonate knee wall where we, part of the polycarbonate's buried below the soil line, and we also put a 1-foot wide metal flashing around at the soil line to kind of help with rodents. And we haven't had any rodents in the greenhouse until this last fall. I had a hole punched into one of the end walls on the polycarbonate for some irrigation. I forgot to plug it up right away, so a family of mice moved in, but we got them with our traps. Go to the next slide. Yes. Our greenhouse is automated. The sides roll up and down by themselves. There's a peak vent, and these are all controlled by the same controller, which vents not only because of temperature, but also humidity. So there's a high humidity override. Obviously the furnace and the venting can't fight each other too much, but they do in fact fight each other a little bit. And that is to maintain good humidity levels, which I vent at 90% relative humidity. So we are burning more propane by venting for humidity, but the whole purpose of burning propane in your greenhouse is to control the environment, and humidity is a big part of the environment. Prior to 2019, I guess we didn't really have a heated greenhouse built until the spring of 2020, but every year prior to that, where we were renting, our nursery flats would always develop green algae fungus on them or whatever. But since we had a nursery that has humidity, we don't see any kind of algae growth on our trays anymore. And the humidity is very important to manage in a greenhouse for plant disease reasons. We have insect screening installed on our roll-up side, which does reduce the airflow. And this spring, or hopefully before the spring, we will be adding more shutters and ventilation to the gable ends to kind of help with that. So we have exhaust fans running in the summertime, even because that insect netting does restrict the airflow, and it can overheat pretty quickly in there. We've got a 30 or 40% shade cloth we put on mid-June, and that stays on until about the end of August. Early on in the greenhouse, we would put down 1 inch of compost per bed before planting the tomatoes, which we plant mid-March or the end of March, which means we keep the house heated at 60 degrees overnight. I might dial that back a little bit. We don't need the tomatoes as early as we are having them, maybe save a little bit money on propane. But there is a time, plant our tomatoes mid-March, and then we have tomatoes at the farmers market by the end of May, but our CSA doesn't start until like the second week in June. So we kind of have like 2 weeks of like too many tomatoes at the market. Our markets can only absorb so much of that. And even though we're the only ones that have the tomatoes, the 2 farmers markets we work, this is a little bit off topic, but I'm in Buffalo, Minnesota, and my wife goes to Mound, and these are not big city markets. They're nice sized towns. But we do very well there. We've been going to these markets a long time. We have established customers, and there are other growers there, but we are by far the most set up, or the biggest. We're the big fish in the pond at these little markets, so we do pretty well there. And we started at them, and sales were nominal, but I think the sales at the market that I work when we first started versus last year are quadruple per week, 5 times as much revenue. And that could be because the markets are getting busier and better. I don't want to take all the credit for that, but having if you are working farmers markets, being consistent, we're much better growers. We have the bags of salad that everybody wants. We've got cucumbers, tomatoes all the time. So, and there was part of me for a long time, I wanted to get down into the Twins, get to those big city markets, hustle those yuppies, but I'd just be another small, another farm amongst a bunch of other great farms. And I'm quite happy staying at our kind of small town markets. Okay, back on topic. So pre-plant, we would do an inch of compost, a little bit of nitrogen early on to get those tomatoes started. The soil's kind of cold in March. We broad fork in the greenhouse every spring. I know we talked about not broad forking except for carrots and parsnips, but we will broad fork not just the greenhouse, but the unheated tunnels, because early on in the spring, the soil is pretty cold, and opening it up like that kind of helps warm it up. And furthermore, these protected growing areas are very expensive growing areas, so we do everything we can to maximize our investment. I might be able to fit our walk-behind tractor in our door, but I've never even tried. We do everything by hand. I don't have a tilther, like drill powered little tiller. But we don't really need to be tilling really. I mean, I know the tilter is like an inch or two depth to incorporate amendments, but what we do is we just put down the minerals and we put down our nitrogen source underneath the compost. Our greenhouse is starting to get a little bit higher levels of phosphorus than the field. So a couple of years ago, we started with some peat moss in addition to the compost. And part of us also maybe thinks that the acidic peat moss will help with our alkalinity problems. I'm not sure if that's true. But either way, the peat moss is a great source of organic matter that doesn't have any nutrients in it. You still want to be increasing your organic matter, or at least maintaining that organic matter level, but you don't always need all of the nutrients that the compost will be bringing. And let's say in the future we get to a point where our fields really can't take any more phosphorus specifically. I might look into getting some peat moss delivered to the farm, just so we're still putting something down as a mulch. Which is certainly more, it's an expense, but when I used to buy straw as mulch or garlic, we'd do about 5 bales per bed at $5 a bale. So you're spending $25 on straw that just always brings in weed seeds, and then it's in the way when the garlic is done. So either peat moss or sphagnum peat is a question. I just go to Menards. I don't know, the green and white bag. I don't think it matters as much. It's just it's really long lasting organic matter, those acidic peat bogs. But I could be wrong. I would look into it, but I've just been using the stuff at Menards because it's pretty easy to just drive down there and get it. So starting 2 years ago, we were using the peat moss, and we put that underneath our compost. That stuff is really dry and it's really hydrophobic. In the beginning this year, because our nutrient levels in the greenhouse have improved so much, we are not going to be bringing in compost prior to planting. But we will be bringing in a mixture of compost and peat moss for side dressing. We can go to the next slide. And this talks about our greenhouse amendments. So prior to construction, we put down 3 inches of compost over the greenhouse site. I don't know, I probably would have done more than that initially if I was to do it again. We never use anything manure based for fertility inside of the greenhouse. I think I read somewhere, I heard someone say that the manure fertilizers like the CPM or even manure fertilizer have the more soluble salts in them, and it's those the accumulation of the soluble salts is what we are all trying to avoid in our protected growing areas. And that being said, we need to avoid applying more nutrients than are needed by the crop. We want to be improving our soil, yes, but we don't want to be excessive in anything, because excessive nutrients can become a problem. Excessive soluble salts can become a problem. I haven't had those problems yet. I've only been growing in the greenhouse since 2020, because it took us all of 2019 to build. And you're going to have to expect to side dress your tomatoes for sure if they're going to be growing from mid-May until the end of October or the beginning of October, depends. They need additional fertility more than the soil can provide, especially because in your greenhouse, you are going to be planting them a lot closer. I might have to address some of these questions that are popping up later because I can't talk and read at the same time.
Yeah, we'll have plenty of time for questions. So
Oh,
yeah.
So I'll just ignore those for now. Sorry. Yeah. So our beds in the greenhouse are 5 feet on center instead of 4. We needed the extra airflow between rows of tomatoes. So I do a double row of tomatoes on that bed. So 2 rows of tomatoes on the bed. The rows are about a foot apart. And in each of those rows, the plants are 2 feet apart. So if the tomatoes were all in one row down the middle of our bed, the tomatoes would be 1 foot apart, which is pretty close together. So in order for these long season plants to maintain vigor, they need to be side dressed. And honestly, I have not solved this yet. Every year we get to the point where we're getting right past that first flush of really nice looking heavily loaded fruits on the plants, and then it kind of is downhill from there, and then we add some stuff and we kind of hopefully get things turned around before the end of the season. So I'm still figuring this out. Let's see, and I can tell you what worked and what did not work. 2 years ago, I was trying to inject organic soluble nutrients into the drip line, be it fish hydrolysate or fish emulsion. I bought this like powdered soy-based nitrogen thing, and then like soluble potassium. So we seem to be most deficient in our tomato plants, nitrogen and potassium. I obviously had deficiencies in the trace minerals, but that was probably more of a function of our pH than the amendments. I send tomato leaves to Midwest Labs, the lab I use to get analyzed for nutrients. So I'm not just guessing that they're deficient. They, if they're really deficient, you can tell by looking at them. But we seem to have the best success with side dressing our greenhouse crops, or this is the point at which they started to turn around and look healthy again. It was when we actually laid down granule fertilizers, and for us it was feather meal and sulfate of potash for the source of nitrogen and potassium, and then we put compost on top of that, because these organic fertilizers need the soil contact and moisture to decompose and become plant available nutrients. Last year, knowing what I knew from the previous year, I was all ready to just use the feather meal and sulfate of potash. I bought this little tool from Neversink Farms. They make it. It's called the Zipper. Like, it's a long handle tool. You drag it through the soil on one end and you make a little trench, and then you can flip it over, and then it closes the trench. So it's like, yeah, it's a lot of work to be hauling in buckets of compost like by hand, obviously, and it's like trying to squeeze down these crowded tomato rows and not wreck anything with buckets of compost. So I thought I'd make a little trench and bury the fertilizers that way, and then put make sure our drip line is on top of that so it's adequately moist for it to decompose. And when I was doing that, I was like, man, I'm really kind of ripping up these tomato roots. I hope they'll be fine. They're tomatoes. They do nothing but grow vigorously. But as it happens, we had bacterial canker come in on some seeds. I think it was last year. Supposedly it's seed borne, and I could just that tool just, I feel like it really just kind of spread the disease down the rows, or it was me slicing the roots. It was really hot. It was like July, so it was like 90 degrees in there. It was a really hot week, and just a week after I did that, we started to see our plants just wilt and die. We did not lose all of our tomatoes last year. As soon as we realized what it was, we had confirmed from the plant disease clinic at the University of Minnesota. We bagged up the plants and removed them from the greenhouse, and we continued to do that towards the end of the season. We stopped pruning at that point. We knew the lifespan of these tomatoes was numbered, and the more that we handled them, the more we'd spread the disease. So that being said, a lot of our tomatoes made it to the end of the season, which for our purposes is late September to mid-October. Because we do the winter CSA, we need to flip these beds by, I'm going to even say early October for us to plant salad greens, for them to be mature by mid-December at the latest. So that's a tough decision a grower needs to make. And this picture in the background here can kind of show the transition of tomatoes to fall stuff. So you gotta pull, even though you don't want to, sometimes you gotta pull those tomatoes out a little earlier, even if they're alive, just to make sure you get your winter stuff in. And honestly, by the end of September, early October, at least at our farmers markets, everybody else has got tomatoes. Everybody, these are a little bit more rural towns, so more people have gardens, so everybody's sick of tomatoes by then. They've got enough, so it's not a big deal to rip them out and replant. And lastly, avoid watering more than you need to. I try to shoot for that 1 inch of rainfall per week. You can just do the math on how many gallons are an inch of rain per acre, and go from there. Your drip lines are going to have ratings on how much water they put out per 100 feet. It's usually per hour, how many gallons per hour. So that's not that hard to figure out. I also found, I can't remember if it's the University of Missouri or publication, but the actual ounces of water that is needed per tomato plant in a heavily pruned scenario based on the age of the weeks. So kind of found like a happy medium of 1 inch of rainfall, and then versus the other chart I found, it was ounces per plant per, was a week or day or something. Either way, our tomato plants get watered every day. We've got timers and stuff, and I'll get into that in a second. But we can go to the next slide. We can look at year 1, 2019 on the left versus the greenhouse fertility results from the spring of last year. The first page I showed you guys was I took the field sample in the fall of 2022. Well, my most recent test I pulled was the spring of last year in our greenhouse. So our pH is still quite high. It's 7.7, which is what our field was at before with the elemental sulfur. So I expect that to be a little bit more reasonable. But the thing organic matter is 7.1% in our greenhouse, and I feel like it's gotten less compost in the field at this point, but it's almost twice. It's about twice of our organic matter of our field. I don't know if it could just be the peat moss is really contributing to that. It could be the lack of rainfall. That's obviously a huge difference. There's no rainfall in our greenhouse. It's just well water. But our soil is really sandy. I got 4 lines of drip tape on a bed, but even still, that water is like going straight down. So a lot of the upper profile of our soil greenhouse, I think, just stays really dry, which might slow down some of that decomposition of the organic matter. otherwise, we got the elevated levels of nutrients. But if you look at the greenhouse towards the bottom, those trace minerals, they did not climb as much as the field did. And if we go to the next slide, we can see the fields analysis from the fall of last year versus the spring analysis of the greenhouse. And the fields trace minerals look great. They're climbing, and I think that's because of the pH. Those trace minerals and metals they're really not available once things get really alkaline. And I think the presentation that came before me for this group and touched a lot on that. I remember seeing an image of the each nutrient going across, and it was fat or narrow depending on the pH. And you can really, if you go back and look at that, or you find that online, those trace elements, they just aren't available at the high pH. So be careful about addressing your soil's shortcomings by adding these trace elements, because it could just be a function of your pH. Okay, next slide. I consider the irrigation in our greenhouse as part of the fertility. We're organic farmers. We take care of our soil, and our soil takes care of us. But in order for there to be enough biology happening in the soil, there needs to be moisture. And like I said, our soil is super sandy, excessively drained. So I put 4 lines of drip tape with 6-inch emitter spacing over each bed. I could get away with just 1 line per row of tomatoes and to water the tomatoes, but I feel like keeping the ground evenly moist helps with the soil biology to do its thing. I also like to water in with sprinklers. I water the plants in the spring. And typically, actually, this picture must have been taken right after planting tomatoes, but we also plant the shoulders of the beds to like beets or lettuce just to kind of maximize the space that we're heating. But I really do like to have that use the sprinklers for the first 7 to 10 days, because the soil in the greenhouse is so dry coming out of the winter that it really needs just a nice big drink of water. Go to the next slide. I've got a picture of our manifold that's in the greenhouse. On the left side of the manifold are the timers for different zones. Everything in the greenhouse gets watered every day, once a day. For I think the tomatoes, it was like 11 minutes a day, and the cucumbers was more like 13 or 14. Cucumbers prefer a little bit more water. And then we got a maize injector plumbed into our manifold just in case. I did not find good results with injecting water soluble nutrients. It could have been me just not doing enough of it. But I still would use the fish hydrolysate right after planting. And I don't know if anybody here has got something to say about fish hydrolysate or fish emulsion, but it's like a 2-4-3 analysis, and that's the concentrate on the bucket. And so there's like nothing in it. I don't know how to approach it in my mind, except for that it like the soil life likes it being there, because you dilute your 2-4-3 with your gallons of water, and like what's from the soil science point of view, there's like nothing there, but I use it anyway, I guess. There's like we don't know more than we do, and it's not going to hurt anything unless you're really overdoing it. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. I've got a page about strategies for feeding long season crops such as tomatoes and cucumbers. And I did touch on this a little bit earlier, but we send in leaves to be sampled every month just to kind of make sure we're staying on the right track, which historically speaking, we have not been staying on the right track, but we're getting better each year. Make sure if you're doing the tissue analysis, that you get the leaves from the right part of the plant. The lab that I use has some instructions on that, but they can't be like super old leaves or super young leaves. Kind of have to be that middle-aged leaves. And I send in my first tissue sample. The plants are not up to the trellis wires yet, but they're fully loaded and they have not started ripening. It's like maybe the week before they start to ripen. And that's when I know that the plants have put a ton of their energy and effort into those first fruits, and they're going to start to want a little bit more. And I would assume if I put 2 feet in between each plant instead of one, this won't be as much of an issue. But so last year, for example, we didn't do any fruit pruning, which I do recommend doing, but we did not do any last year. And this was like the first big week of harvesting the first flush of ripe fruits. And we harvested 1,000 pounds of tomatoes in 1 week from 300 beefsteak tomato plants. So that's why we plant them really close together and why we give them a ton of attention. Because at least at our markets, we have tomatoes for a solid 2 months before the other vendors do. So we kind of have the market cornered, and we can charge what they're worth. We're getting it's $4. We're charging $4 a pound for like hybrid beefsteak tomatoes. But by the time August rolls around and everybody else has them, it's like nobody's going to pay that anymore, which is fine. We made our tomato money. We only use greenhouse specific hybrids for tomatoes and cucumbers. The first 2 years of growing in the greenhouse, we were growing heirlooms, but they could not stand up to leaf mold pressure. They would have a hard time just keeping their leaves on them, and we'd be like lowering and leaning them once a week, and they would have like no fruit on them. It's like, what's going on here? So we still grow the heirlooms, but they're in our caterpillar tunnels, which they don't get planted till mid-May at the earliest in our region. We prune our beefsteak varieties to one vine, and we're gonna make sure we prune fruits at least early on, to keep that plant from overexerting itself. Because it's, we can have 6 to 8 more beefsteak tomato fruits on one truss, and it's just a little too much at one time. You need to treat your plant, slow and steady wins the race with these long season fruiting crops. Generally speaking, our tomatoes needed more nitrogen and potassium more than anything else. We were deficient in some traces, but again, that was likely due to our pH. And my agronomist, recommended maybe 20 to 30 pounds per acre of nitrogen, potassium, equal amounts of each of those for a side dressing per month. But obviously, that's going to be different for your scenario based on your soils, what you've added in the soils, and where your plants are going. Dry amendments work best for us instead of the water soluble ones. The dry amendments need to be incorporated into the soil for best results. And this year, since we need to kind of dial back the amount of phosphorus our compost is giving our soil, we're not going to apply any compost pre-plant. We're going to make a mixture of compost and peat moss to side dress with. And that's really just so we can bury those amendments that we're spreading. So we'll band them on either side of the bed, on the shoulders, and then we'll come back with buckets of the peat and compost mixture and just use enough of that just to bury the amendments, and then make sure we put our drip line right over that banded fertilizer. We can go to the next slide. Got pruning strategies for tomatoes and cucumbers. We like to keep our beefsteak tomatoes to one vine. We're going to do some fruit pruning moving forward. Last year was the first year we put cherry tomatoes in the greenhouse, and we did 2 vines per plant, because the cherry tomatoes they grow a lot taller and faster than the beefsteak. So my mentality was 2 vines on one root clump would kind of slow them down a little bit in a way. So those 2 vined plants we planted, instead of a foot apart, we did 18 inches apart. So in actuality, our vines were every 9 inches in the bed instead of every foot. And that seemed to be fine. They seemed to be pretty happy until they got sick. we use a modified or an umbrella method for the cucumbers. It's essentially one vine up to the trellis wire, and we prune off all of the fruits to about knee height, and then after that point we allow one fruit at every other node until it's getting closer to the wire. It's detrimental to the overall yield of your cucumbers to have a lot of fruits early on, hence the early fruit pruning. And once the plant reaches the wire, the theory is you let 2 or 3 suckers grow, and then you don't prune those off. You kind of they become the new suckers. So you have one vine going up, and then you got 2 vines coming down. So those 2, you leave 3 suckers, pick 2 of the strongest. You want to have a backup just in case. But then you terminate the original vine on the cucumbers, and the 2 new vines take over. I think our modified approach to that is keeping the original vine and then just developing one additional vine to go with that first original one, because we tried the terminating of the original vine, and then we didn't have cucumbers for a couple of weeks because cut the head off the plant, and then the new vines weren't old enough to produce fruit. Yeah, and I think that's actually my last slide.
Yeah, it looks like it. So thanks, Jimmy. That was great.
Thank you.
So we've got, like you said, we've got a few questions in the chat. I know you addressed a couple of these. So if you wanted, I think you can see the chat at your end, right? Did you want to go through? And then we can
I'm sure I can. I just gotta find the right spot.
So Leanna had a question about the pH increase, which you talked about a little bit based on the lime application by the previous owner of the land, I think.
Yeah, he didn't give me a specific amount of lime he put down. He just said he put a bunch of lime down, and especially in this area, it's so sandy around here. Farmers just get free lime from water treatment plants. They get a machine. They don't even have to pay to rent to spread it, so they can go a little buck wild. And I thought in the past that lime can only take pH to neutrality to 7, but my agronomist my current agronomist and my former agronomist both kind of concurred with the fact that it can lead to alkalinity.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I said, the elemental sulfur is a way to combat that, but it doesn't work if your natural native soil has a bunch of free calcium carbonate in it. And you can find articles about this online, just search for stuff like how to acidify your soil, and a lot of people talk about blueberries and stuff in these articles, but there's just demonstrations on that. And so we're going to have plenty of sulfur in our soil because of that elemental sulfur, which does take at least a whole season to do its thing. So we're going to have plenty of SO4, which is the plant available form of sulfur, but we're still going to put down a little gypsum because calcium, and it seems like we never have enough calcium, at least in our soils. Every year it's been recommended for us to apply it. And every year I have, an hour phone call conversation with our agronomist about what we're doing and where we're going. I just remember this one year, this was early on, I was just reading the soil report, and it's like, oh, we need magnesium. So I bought a bag of Epsom salts, and then I was asking my agronomist at the time different question, but I brought that up, and he's like, oh no, but you're adding lime to your soils, which some lime can have magnesium in it, I think, but just raising our pH to a more appropriate, because this was an old rented spot. We were at 5.5 for a pH, so we needed lime, but just correcting the pH made us have enough magnesium. So I still have that 50-pound bag of Epsom salt.
Yeah.
I can't seem to find the chat. I don't want to risk closing this, so if you just want to read questions.
Yeah, so I actually was wondering if I can combine a couple of questions because they're sort of getting at similar questions or similar topics. Ashley had a question about the very high testing for phosphorus, especially whether you plan to add less compost overall, and also whether your tunnels were testing higher, which we saw that they are. And then John Hendrickson was wondering if you could give an example of how you've used your monthly tissue analysis to adjust your fertility management practices. So they're kind of, they're different questions, but both getting at the management of fertility and those high levels of phosphorus.
Yeah. So with we are going to be putting down that 4.5 inches with the wood chips and half of our high rotation areas. But then after that, we hope to just maintain that until, hopefully we don't get to that 150 ppm. But if we do start to approach that, we'll certainly have to stop with the compost. Because I think that would probably be the best way to fix that. And last year we dialed back. I was like, we can't be spreading all this compost. It's really expensive and it takes a lot of time. So we did just the one load, and we had so many weeds, but that was kind of our fault for letting them all set seed. So my wife was like, we got to do the 2 loads and spending so much time weeding. I'm like, we can't afford to do that year after year after year. So I was like, why don't we'll put down the thick layer, and then we'll maintain that. Because the thick layer, the 4.5 inches for us is 3 loads of compost with our machine.
Mm-hmm.
So we do 3 this year, and then 1 next year, and 1 next year, and 1 next year. That's less compost than 2 loads this year, 2 loads next year, 2 loads the year after that. But yeah, if we start to get excessive, we certainly can't be doing that anymore. My new agronomist, I had this question last fall, which is why I pulled my field sample in the fall, because it's like, all right, we can't get excessive on phosphorus. I really need to see what we're doing now so we can think about it. And I remember he said he visited a farm in western Wisconsin, similar kind of lighter soil, and they've been putting down this, it's 80 to 100 tons of compost per acre. Kind of, that's that 1.5 inches or more. And this farm's been doing that for a lot longer than we have. And our agronomist didn't seem to be super concerned about the elevated phosphorus from compost. He suggested that our growing phosphorus levels was more attributed to our composted poultry manure fertilizer we're using, which, every time we apply it before planting, and I apply it before like the second crop in the season too, or if there's a third crop, maybe if it's radishes, I won't do anything, but 45 pounds of phosphorus per acre per application, if you get do that 3 times in a season, that's a lot of phosphorus. I hope he's right.
Yeah.
But Rue and I were talking before we opened chat that this deep compost mulch system is relatively new, and there's still a lot to learn about it. So, and the phosphorus coming from compost, it's coming from the compost a little bit too, definitely.
Yeah, that's something I was wondering. It'd be like I'll probably try and look at some of the numbers and figure out whether most of the phosphorus is coming from the CPM, the composted poultry manure, versus the compost. And that's why, like, I used to use a lot of composted poultry manure, and now at the research station we're using a lot more feather meal just to avoid that problem with the amount of phosphorus. And I know you said that you are starting to use that a bit more. Is that right?
Yeah, we're not going to use the CPM anymore. We're going to switch to feather meal.
Yeah.
We have plenty of phosphorus. And if I need some potassium, I can just reach for the sulfate potash, which is organic, and it's mined, whatever.
So yeah, the other part, which was, I guess they were really pretty distinct questions. John had asked about how you're using the monthly tissue analysis to adjust your fertility management.
Yeah, I did say I'm still figuring this out. So I think what I'm gonna do is, so we got the tomato vines. They're fully loaded with fruit that's gonna ripen soon. I might send in a tissue sample then, and then 2 weeks after that, do a side dressing, and then wait 2 weeks and see what the plants are doing, because the organic, it's the organic fertilizers. They're not super readily available right away. It's going to take time for the plant to absorb them. But I do know I really need to get something down right at that stage where they're fully loaded and they're going to start ripening, because that's just me looking at them is like they're after that point is when they start to look like they need something. And
Yeah,
then
like you said, if you wait till they show the signs, then you've kind of missed that opportunity.
And it's not, not necessarily going to kill them, but you're just going to have less tomatoes for a little while until things turn around. And I don't like doing that. I don't like having that happen in July, because I still got the market cornered.
Yeah.
And our CSAs love it. We're mostly, CSA is 2/3 of our business, and so we do not hold off. We're not like saving stuff just for the market. We're taking care of our CSA people as much as we can. And yeah, my new agronomist, he made it sound like, that first application, about 20 pounds of N and K per acre would be a good place to start. In 2020, I was trying to correct a nitrogen deficiency with what's that water soluble nitrogen that's mined in Chilean nitrate.
Oh,
yeah. And then we had the worst aphid outbreak ever. Don't use Chilean nitrate. It's just too water soluble. And it's officially, I don't know how sustainable.
Yeah, you're not supposed to. I think it is not actually allowable anymore under organic regulations. Okay. Yeah.
I'm not certified, so I don't, I do everything I can to be organic. I don't use chemicals, but I don't know the actual rules.
Yeah.
As far as I remember, it was being like, unless your soil or unless your test results show that you need it, you can't use it, which ours did. Well, that's another thing. You're trying to maximize your space in your greenhouse by planting the shoulders, and we way overdid that our first year to the detriment of our cucumbers and tomatoes. We were like doing rows of spinach where we were just like picking the leaves, like harvesting for a month off of them, and we had that bed is the spinach we were harvesting in our cucumber bed, and then next to it we had like the cucumbers with just beets that were like a once and done harvest, and you could just visually see the difference. So like in the field, we plant heads of lettuces, 3 rows per bed, 10 inches apart in all directions. But in the greenhouse last spring, we transplanted just on the shoulders. So row down one side, row down the other on the edge of the tomatoes. We did 18 inches apart. Because we learned the hard way. And unfortunately, that's the most thorough way you can learn is the hard way. So we learned not to overdo it. We are just going to do beets and head lettuce. One cut and they're done, they're out of there. And we're gonna give them plenty of space. We'll transplant our beets a foot apart, in the field they're much closer, but that's plenty. You can maybe stick some radishes in between the 2 rows of tomatoes, but yeah, don't get greedy with that early stuff.
Yeah. So there's a couple of other questions or comments from the chat. So Troy Jackson had said that this was when we were talking about, I think when you were discussing using peat moss to get the organic matter in the mulching, but not the nutrients. Troy said that they use several big truckloads of leaves from fall yard cleanup, starting out 2 inches deep, and by spring there's a lot less. Free and no weeding, but they may have gotten jumping worms that way. So certainly I've heard from quite a number of people growing either close to or in more urban areas that they will use a lot of leaf a lot of leaf mulch. And one of the urban gardens that I work with does that as well. And even like will build beds out of leaf compost that is still pretty leafy. Frankly, it's not broken down that much, which is kind of an interesting substrate to be trying to plant into. I've seen some nutrient
That's
issues
what I
there.
was first thing came to mind is like, yeah, you can transplant in that, but your first crop of lettuce comes out and you want to seed something there, and then what? Then what? You got leaves in the way. And we actually, one year we had the city of Princeton deliver a couple of dump trucks of leaves. We were going to use it for our mulching garlic because I was sick of all the dirty straw coming in that I had to pay for, and then just make there's a weediest spot on the farm because straw. But then we had the leaves come in, and there's a bunch of grass clippings in there. And it's like, where's this grass from? Is it from a golf course? Is it full of whatever? I know homeowners don't get as many of the forever chemicals that some of the weed-free hay farmers are spraying for whatever reason. But I think that we ended up not using the leaves. We just we composted them. We have a compost heap on the end of our field where we dump all the weeds and sick vegetable plants and scraps and whatnot. But I don't use that compost on the farm. The biggest reason I've got like a baby Kubota tractor, and it would take me forever to turn the pile regularly. But also it's just a spot where we put a bunch of diseased plants and weeds full of seeds, and I don't want to spread that in my field. So I'm trying to come up with creative ways to use it in the landscaping, I guess. But made some flower beds out of it. And someone asked what we're using for mulching our garlic now. 3 inches of compost. I think I'll have to dig in my notes, but I think our alliums, garlic and onions, are getting kicked out to the farther reaches of the field. So this was the field area where we're just going to do like an inch or an inch and a half compost before planting. And I want to, if I'm going to do alliums, I'm going to give them 3 inches of compost, in the form of mulching garlic. And then the onions really like everything you can give them. And we actually can grow some awesome onions now on our sand, which took a couple of years when we were renting near in Wright County. We had, we had half of our field was loam and half was loamy sand, but the onions really like the heavier ground, and we struggled to get them back up to size again. So yeah, even though, like I said, we're having the far parts of the field have less compost, if I have like a nice rotation, which I'm trying to 12 years in, I'm trying to come up with a good rotation. But that'll be a nice thing to kind of have a nice instance where we can put down a lot of compost again. And it might be a situation where I don't even put down compost before, I don't know, like winter squash or something. But and for the last couple of 2-3 years for potatoes, we would plant the potatoes first and then put the compost on top of that. And I bought one of those tine rake weeders from Two Bad Cats. LC. It's like a baby Leslie tine weeder, and I kind of like rigged up this frame for my 3-point hitch. So I used that a lot for the potatoes. Just drag over the tine weeder a bunch of times with the tractor before they pop up. Then I start to bring in a little bit more aggressive, like cultivating shanks and whatnot. And then, eventually, hopefully get them hilled on time, because that time of the year is just crazy to do things at the time. So even though, like, we try not to bring the tractor into the field, and we try to, we're doing most things by hand, it's really helpful to have like it's a 3-point toolbar on the back of our tractor. If I can just use that for the potatoes or the squash, we got plenty of other stuff we can be doing that time of the year. Everything needs weeding, and we still got to be planting. And CSA is starting soon. Oh my gosh, we're running out of time to do stuff. Even though, like an expensive cultivating tool, you might only use it for a couple of weeks. Well, it's like that's when things are happening. Is in that late May to early June. It's like, you can't fall behind there.
Yeah.
You're going to pay for it all season.
Something you said fairly early on, you mentioned putting in oats and peas as a cover crop. And I wanted to ask how cover crops are fitting into your system.
They're starting to fit in. We've never really done much with them in the past. In our rented spots, we might have had enough extra space to grow maybe like a season's worth of cover crops. And when we were renting, we weren't doing a lot of compost. We would do like an inch of compost, and that was before we had a machine to spread it. So we had a tractor, we could load it up into a wagon, but we had to shovel it off by hand then. So presently, as we get into August, mid-June till like the third week of July is really hard to find open places to plant things, because by the middle of July, third week in July, I need to get my last carrots and beets in before it's too late. So we're like aggressively seeking out space to be planting all this stuff. But once August rolls around, we've got beds opening up that we don't need to replant to a cash crop. So I just want something growing there, and I'm going to make sure it's not lamb's quarters, but oats and peas are pretty cheap enough, and we just broadcast it by hand and then use a power harrow on our walk behind to incorporate them a little bit. And make sure we're watering, water or cover crops so they germinate. We only have
There
2
was
acres of
a
production.
great session at the Organic Vegetable Production Conference that we were talking about before the meeting started, talking about cover crops, and like specifically the farmer who was presenting, Kat Becker, was talking about manage your cover crops like crops. They're going to repay it.
Yeah, I'm just broadcasting them and harrowing them in lightly, so they definitely watering them is great. And
Yeah.
we now have enough sprinkler lines built. I don't have to move sprinklers in our field. I have enough, and I've got irrigation timers. I got on both sides of the field, so I can essentially hook up my entire field to sprinkler lines and program the timers, and it'll water the whole field. Not all at once, of course. I get about 40 gallons a minute with our irrigation well, but I can, put down a half inch of rain within, I think, 30 hours for the whole field. Because each zone's got to run for a few hours. But yeah, I do that because I'm not drilling them in. If I drilled them in 2 inches deep, they have better success without some irrigation traps. But yeah, they're important, because if they don't germinate, then the weeds are just going to germinate, and the lamb's quarters are going to be 6 inches tall, dropping seeds in September on you. That's no fun. And we started using 2 years 2 years ago we had a nice crop of vetch and rye going into the winter after our potatoes, which was great. I was like, we need something to kind of glue our soil back together after potatoes. It's pretty rough on them. But we ended up tarping it right away in the spring. We did our first outdoor transplanting, and then the next day we saw what the deer did to all of our transplants.
Yeah,
because the deer had been so used to coming into our field and eating that nice vetch and rye patch that we had. And we have 4 separate rows of electric fence around our field, and at that time last spring I only had 2 of them activated. I don't take them down in the winter, I just kind of fix them every spring. And so that wasn't enough, so we tarped our cover crop, put row covers on everything we had planted that already didn't have row covers, and then I spent the day getting the rest of the fence active and putting peanut butter on tin foil and putting it on the wires so they would learn about the fence, because it's not keeping them out, it's just they don't want to get shocked. And I grew up in the country along a river, and across the river was a regional park. But this area of where we are in Princeton is epic for deer. We hired some of the neighbor kids last year, and the one teenage boy, Peter, he went out one evening last fall with thermal goggles and walked up and down the road that was like a half mile from our house, and he counted 170 deer. Yeah,
Yeah,
our
you've got
fields
to
are
get.
surrounded by woods. There's 2 lakes. It's just they love it here. It's insane. You drive out of here at dawn or dusk, and within a couple miles, you're gonna see over 10, 20 deer. But that being said, once we got the fence back up, the 4 rows of fence back up and baited, and made sure it didn't get grounded out because of grass, it's pretty effective.
Mhm.
And we have to have a little bit, some of the fence wires a little bit lower for the fawns and whatnot. It doesn't really help against the turkeys, but they're not that bad. They're kind of silly. But
So I probably should have invited people to like please unmute and ask questions if you have questions. Um, so I want to make sure that there's time for people to do that. We are a little after 5:30, so I realize everyone's probably probably thinking about doing something else for a little bit.
yeah,
But did anyone have
I'm
some
so dead.
questions? I was wondering about how, like, assuming the cover crop survives the deer, how are you terminating that cover crop? Are you bringing in a like flail
Oh,
mower or something?
yeah. So we did that again. I got a nice crop of vetch and rye after the potatoes, or most of the potatoes. We're gonna do a little side by side, but my plan is to do summer or winter squash
Hmm.
after the vetch and rye because we don't have to plant the transplants until end of May. We really can't here. So that should be plenty of time to, I'm gonna flail mow the the cover crops. Um, I might flail mow like strips where the winter squash gets planted first. I'm gonna flail mow that and then maybe I'll harrow it a little bit just to mess them up a little bit, not too deep, but then put down a load of compost and plant into that. And then like
Mm.
obviously like every other bed gets winter squash in our setup because they vine.
Yeah,
So I might let the in-between areas get a little bit more headed out first. So mowing does a little bit more of a killing event. But I think if you mow them too early before they're heading, I don't think they're really going to die. And I'm really new
yeah.
to cover crops, but I would like to try to fit them into the rotation whenever I can. And for me, it's like the oats and peas are great after stuff in the fall. It gets to be a point in the fall where it's too late to do that. So we just leave things in place. And as soon as we take the spark off the electric fence, the deer find
Yeah.
that out and they can eat everything anyways. So.
So they'll do the termination for you.
Yes. But yeah, that is something that worries me with the vetch and rye is making sure it stays dead when it needs to stay dead in a no-till or low-till situation. Tarps could certainly be used, or even, I could get a 4 foot wide landscape fabric or whatever, and at least where the squash is growing directly in the soil would be in landscape fabric. As
Mhm.
far as landscape fabric goes, we used to use a lot more of that because we had such great weed pressure when we were renting, but we really only use it for onions
Mhm.
because they need it the most. I try to limit that for rodent reasons mostly, because they just love living underneath the landscape fabrics. We used to have it, every where all the hoops of our caterpillar tunnels went in, we would have landscape fabric down there to help weeds, but um, I really don't want to use it more than I need to.
Yeah. Well, again, I want to say thank you, Jimmy, for a really great presentation that was just packed with information. And yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to put that together and present that tonight.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.